And when I was a young man, 21, 22, I was a pastor down in Halifax, and God started putting the light on in my spirit. I started to see things. And I remember getting these burdens in prayer. I would be in my office. It was in the basement of the church. 2021, I had a lot of fire in my belly. Just had a lot of zeal, but not a lot of wisdom. I would be praying down in my cube. I wasn't going to say my cube, but it was my office in those days. And I remember I had a little plant on top of the window. Was just like one of those basement windows, you know, those tiny ones. And even probably had one of those like steel drums that you had to look up to see the sky. So I put my little plant right there. It had about 5 leaves on it. It was one of those shamrocks. It was a pitiful little plant. It had 5 leaves on it. And I remember praying for that plant. Lord, would you touch that plant? And he did. I remember it was like 2 weeks after I prayed that prayer, 4 sprouts came out and it began to grow up. I had 9 leaves now. I thought, that's awesome, God, you answered that prayer. And then I said, God, if you can do that, you can do more. Let more grow. Well, within 2 weeks, there were 5 more. So 14 leaves. I thought, this is awesome. God is answering my prayer for this plant. And then I started getting the idea, well, if he'll do that, he'll do other stuff too. And one time, I remember my youth group we started with 4 kids, 4 very churchy kids, 4 very religious churchy kids, and most of them left. You know what I mean? And within a year and a half, it was up to 75, and most of them were coming out of like backgrounds with. I remember we took them on a trip to a mountain to do some skiing, and there was 9 of them out back smoking dope behind the church. So we were like reaching these kids. I remember one of the pastors came up. He said, "Do you know that one of your kids are out back smoking dope?" I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." And he said, "Don't apologize. They're the best. You know, you've got them here." He said, they're making this place, you know, an interesting place. I was freaked out. It was like we had 30 kids there, and there were like 9 of them smoking dope out back of the church. Well, God began to move in that youth group, and I began to see kids came in. I remember a couple of kids came from another church. They had been wounded, and I began to love them. And in that place of loving them, they began to love some of their classmates in school and began to drag them in. And before you know it, we had half dozen kids came in through the doors, gave their hearts to the Lord, filled up with the Holy Spirit, began to well, in those days it was really important for them to speak in tongues, but they began to speak in tongues. But after they began to speak in tongues, they became on fire in the Spirit, and many of them began to prophesy and even began to preach. I began to train them to preach, and next thing you know, the group grew that way. So we went up to 75. At one point, I remember the prophetic gift began to burn inside of me, and I remember seeing this black boy. Halifax has a lot of black people, actually, but my youth group didn't. There weren't many at all. We were very, very white. We were actually, very, very white. And I remember seeing this black boy in the Spirit, and I said, Lord, there are no black children here. Bring one in. We had an event the following week, and there was a black kid there. Freaked me right out. I thought, what happened there? I saw one, and then it occurred, and that's how I began to learn that God can speak and give you burdens to pray and to see, and as you pray, it began to come to pass.